about building the conditions to live without violence. This is what brings politics into the equation for me so strongly. Because when one thinks about that question, about building conditions to live without violence, the complexity of what we have to think about comes to the fore. And I very much see violence as the opposite of peace, not conflict, nor war. I put violence into the centre of our thinking, because when I do that, I very much think about humanity and I think about our bodies. Violence is somatic. It's about the impact on our bodies of hurt and pain. And this idea of violence as the opposite of peace helps me then to think about Paul's challenges, because, for instance, I think what difference would it make to the way we looked at the world if we started our premises from the vulnerable body, not from the masterful body? That if we went from this notion that man, in commas, could master the planet, instead of that, we actually started from our vulnerabilities, would we actually think very, very differently about our politics, about how we relate to other people? And so putting violence into the centre of our thinking, for me, helps me to think very much about the issues I want to talk about today. So, this is the broad outline of what I want to discuss. So I want to look back on our century, and some of you not your century, and I want to sort of take Paul's sweeping chronology from Cold War to Hot War, a hot world, and try to think about where have we got to in terms of our understanding of politics. I want to put forward the possibility that we might rethink the basis of our relationship between these three ideas of politics, power and violence. And to use a kind of sweeping overview to try and complement Paul's analysis. Now, I put politics into the frame, I'm putting power, I'm putting violence into the frame, I couldn't put economics into the frame. And Thomas Piketty has just written this book that's kind of going around the world, in which he is putting economics in the frame. He's putting economics in the frame of thinking about peace and our thinking about politics. And I think that's an extremely valuable thing he's doing, because really we can't separate out all these different fields. And it's quite interesting because Piketty is putting inequality onto the agenda. Well, not long ago, another book took the world by storm, that of Wilkinson and Pickett, which also looked at the way inequality is correlated to violence. So we've got these tools of trying to help us to understand where we've got to in the world, and the way inequality and the economics of our world is actually undermining the possibility of dealing with both violence and building peace. But I think neither of those works, which look at the kind of structural ways in which our society is evolved and inequality is embedded in it, necessarily focus on the kind of agency that we need for a politics for future peace. So one of the things I'm very interested in talking about today is what kind of agency could we think about building? And how could we reimagine agency? And how, in the light of looking back over agency as it's emerged in the two-thirds of the century so far, how could we think about different kind of agency for the final third? And I've kind of come across sort of this idea of resistance, not resistance in the sense of opposition, but a citizen that is resistant, a citizenship that is resistant. Resistance in the sense that power exerts itself, dominating power, and against something which resists it. So how could we imagine an agency where there is a resistance to the kinds of things that are being thrown at the world today, where people stand firm and exercise some kind of moral agency? How can we begin to actually imagine that kind of agency? Well, we have some examples today of what I would say resistant citizens. But they're of a very particular kind. We have Edward Snowden. I would say that Snowden was a resistant citizen who called a halt to surveillance. Very important. The Guardian as a sort of media outlet played a very important role in promoting that kind of sense of holding firm against a surveillance society that has spread itself to the extent that we have people who listen in to our every kind of communication we have. We have Occupy. That was resistant citizenship, when people took over squares, young people, and they set a halt to the neoliberal form in which capitalism had led the world to crisis in 2008. And then every day when I look at the television, and just this last week when I've seen the trade unionist in Turkey who came out to protest at the way safety had been abandoned for their fellow workers, leading to the loss of life of hundreds. That for me was the examples of resistant citizenship. Now, they don't get articulate. There isn't an alternative coming out to some articulation. But I want to sort of suggest that in some ways, those people are giving us a sense of where agency is in the world today that could be a source for politics for future peace. Now, I didn't want this lecture to be about some utopia vision of peace that was unattainable and not something about what we could do now, here and now. And I turned to sort of try and illustrate this. I turned to Star Trek. And I was going to show you a clip, but it hasn't quite worked. But some of you, I don't know, Trekkies, or I believe Trekkies don't like to be called Trekkies, like to be called Trekkers. If there are in the room, you will know this, the next generation. I used to want to put on a course, Star Trek, for peace studies, because it actually really tried to open up the issue of the role of violence in human interactions, because it conceived a world where humans had gone through a Third World War, and they had then had through the New Warp Drive, the Vulcans had come and helped sort out some of the material problems, and then humanity goes into space and starts forming all these intergalactic coalitions. And then at some point, this character Q kind of comes and tests humanity. It gives humanity tests as to what is it actually achieved. Has humanity been saved? And the sort of themes that Captain Picard comes out with, that challenges Q's cynicism, that actually humanity isn't being saved, is that Captain Picard's always coming along and actually thinking of fellow humanity before himself, and he's always thinking of everybody else. He is, in other words, a figure who kind of represents this peaceful humanity of the future, this utopic idea. And I think in the Star Trek episodes, one can see lots of really powerful dreams of how humanity could be if we had that kind of perfection. If we had Captain Picard's and Mrs. Picard's around the world, who we could really aspire to that kind of human perfection. And it seems to me we cannot base our understanding of peace in terms of like a telos of peace, a telos of some utopia based on human perfection. And that what we need to be doing is building our capacities to be resistant citizens, to be able to get to the point where we can build those conditions to live without violence. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about in more detail now. So, I want to first of all look at these different moments in the century that Paul has asked us to think about. And this trajectory, right from a moment in 1945 when almost the idea of being a citizen was on the agenda. And then we've moved from this citizen idea to a consumer idea. Now, how did we do it? How did it happen? When I look back and I try to remember, I was born still a bit later than 1945, but I began to sort of think back on the years that were important to me growing up as a citizen, as somebody who thought about the world, was engaged politically in some way, and felt some sense of responsibility for the world. And you think, I was so critical of what was going on in that period, but when I look back from the hindsight of today, I saw some actually quite interesting, hopeful moments. We had a moment in this country at least, and to some extent with Bretton Woods Agreement, with all its flaws, there was an attempt to kind of think about how you could create welfare social network, nets for people. There was an attempt to bring the state in to try and think through how to manage the global economy in a way that would, at least this new idea development came into the fore. We criticised it endlessly, but it was very interesting that it was on the agenda at this particular point in time. Politics was very organised. It was organised around big ideas. People actually did act politically. So I was talking to somebody the other day who was going out canvassing for the local election, and he was saying that he would have had 40 people go out with him. You know, a couple of decades ago, he's now got 3 or 4. People did engage in that kind of politics. So we had the idea of citizenship involving social rights, and that welfareism was something that was part of this kind of third generation idea of citizenship. And Marshall, who said citizenship started off with the idea of civil rights, we went to political rights, these were all fought for or struggled for, but by the 1945 period, the idea is you couldn't actually exercise citizenship if you didn't have economic and social rights, if you actually didn't have a means to life. So we had ideas on the horizon which were quite important to sort of thinking about a different kind of world. But of course, there were some very dark aspects of that, some of which are in Paul's paper, because I'll talk about that in a bit more in a minute. But I then looked sort of at the 1989 to 1914 period, the end of the Cold War to today, and the end of utopias. The idea of postmodernism, what's called postmodernist thinking, and it's actually began to kind of question the idea of the subject of change that had guided people with progressive thought in that earlier period, which was usually the idea of the organised white male working class. So the idea was that also perhaps revolutions and utopias of that kind were a bit dangerous. So we had the end of that notion of utopias, and we had what we might call, well, actually the great son of Leeds, Sigmund Bauman, called the times of disengagement, in which if, as Foucault has described it, we were constructed as subjects since the 18th century by the state. Our whole notion of who we are is constructed by the state, and we are subjected to governmentality. The state is intervening in our lives. It's counting us. It's building institutions for us. And we are part of that state project in terms of who we think we are vis-à-vis the state. The end of the Cold War, 1989, times of disengagement, the state withdraws. The state is no longer going to be the agent of these kinds of constructions of our subjectivity. Yes, the state needs surveillance. We know the state is still watching us, but it is withdrawing from those kinds of interventions and leaving the space, if you like, for other agents to come in, but very much agents that are left to whatever the market is trying to create and construct. We have in this period after the Cold War an age of democracy in which Fukuyama famously declared the end of history. But the democracy that came out of this, which was supposed to be the kind of real moment of liberal democracy, when liberal democracy was going to kind of really be everywhere around the world, with democratic transitions in my field, Latin America, elsewhere. But gradually over time, those democracies have become what some people call democracies with adjectives. That is, they're not quite democracies, they're like hybrid democracies or delegated democracies. We have elections, we have electoral systems, but actually those electoral systems have also been characterised by various forms of corruption, manipulation, even violence. Actually, that dawn of liberal democracy was nothing like the new dawn of some widely accepted and model democratic politics that was imagined. We have neoliberalism and neoliberalisation. I mean, we are really, the world is neoliberalised. The global neoliberal agenda transforms the world